the spring of a mattress that must have been caught up in this fire that burned the vehicle. And Brian just had this sinking feeling that something was wrong with this scene. And he said, hey, you know what, Blair, we gotta go. Let's not look at this. We don't know what this is. Let's just go. When they get back to the house, Brian would tell Belinda what he found. How would that van have gotten there? And why was it there? It just didn't make any sense to either of them. Over the first couple of months that they were living in Slanesville, Brian was trying to commute daily to his work in Maryland, but it was taking up hours and hours of his day. He was getting no sleep, and it just didn't make sense. And so even though they only had one car, he started commuting on Monday morning to work and then staying with his mom, who lived in Maryland, and then coming back to Slanesville on Friday night, which would mean that every week, Monday to Friday, Belinda and the kids would be alone in their cabin in the woods in Slanesville with no vehicle. But Belinda had grown up in a very isolated house in the middle of a forest in West Virginia, so she wasn't a stranger to this type of setup, and so really didn't have any issues with this lifestyle that they had in Slanesville. Blair had been asking ever since they moved in if she could go camping one night out in their RV. They had a little RV camper that was parked right outside their property, and she wanted to spend a night out there by herself. And so one week when Brian was away for work, Belinda finally caved and said, okay, Blair, you can stay in the camper tonight. She wasn't thrilled about this idea, but she felt like the kids had a little bit of cabin fever going on because they were so cooped up in this house, and she figured this is an easy way to make Blair feel a little bit happier living here. So she told Blair, once you go in there, I want you to lock the door and not open it again. And Coco, their dog, is going to stay with you. Blair was just fine with this setup. And so that night she went out to the camper. She had Coco with her. She had all her warm clothes on. She brought a lantern with her and some books she was going to read. She goes out and her mom tucks her into her bed inside of the RV and gives her a kiss, and then she leaves. In the camper, there was a pull-out bed that she was on that took up the majority of the floor space in the camper. On her right, as she was laying down, was a big window with a blackout curtain that slid across the whole thing, and she kept that curtain shut. At the foot of her bed to the right was the door that led into the camper, and there was a window on that as well, but there was no blind to block it. And so at some point, Blair is tired. She turns off her lantern and she gets under her covers with Coco right next to her, and she goes to sleep. At some point in the night, Blair wakes up suddenly because Coco is acting really strange. She's very uneasy, and she's looking towards the door that leads into the camper, and she's acting like she just saw something. So Blair sits up, she's trying to calm down Coco, and she looks at the window on the door. And she can look outside, there's a little bit of moonlight outside, so she's got a little bit of illumination. And as she's looking, she sees what looks like a figure walk past the door. She can't tell if it's a person or if it's an animal or what it is, but she definitely saw something walk past the door. And Coco clearly saw it too, because Coco begins growling, and instead of just looking at the door where this figure was, Coco basically follows the figure and is now looking at the window right next to Blair. Blair thinks it's her mom, and so she tries to calm down Coco. She turns on her lantern and she goes to the front door and she peeks her head out. She doesn't see anything. She unlocks it and opens it and pokes her head out. She doesn't see her, and she goes, "Mom?" And there's no one out there. She looks up at the house, which is right next to her, and all the lights are off. There's no sign that her mom left the house. Suddenly feeling really startled, she shuts the door, locks it, and goes back in her bed. Now, the whole time that Blair had turned that lantern on and gone down to the door and yelled for her mom, Coco was still on the bed looking at the window where the blackout curtains were covering up whatever was on the other side. Now, when Blair's going back to the bed, Coco is showing her teeth. She's baring her teeth and she's growling at the window. Blair's totally spooked. She jumps into her bed, throws the covers over her head, and she's sitting there hoping that Coco will just stop and that this will all end and she can go to sleep, but Coco doesn't stop. And she's like reaching out and trying to pull Coco to get under the covers with her, but Coco won't stop. Blair decides she has to take a look out that window, and she thinks maybe it is my mom. Maybe I just missed her before and she's trying to come in. Maybe she was knocking and I didn't hear her. And so she takes her covers off her head, gets right up next to the side of the wall. She's underneath the window, which is right next to her. And she starts pulling aside that curtain. And as soon as she's got a view out the window, she sees a dark figure that looks like a man or something standing right outside the glass, looking down into her camper. She's so scared, she drops the curtain and then just gets under her covers. Coco goes right on top of Blair and is standing over Blair, basically protecting her. And at some point, Blair does manage to fall asleep. Meanwhile, on the same night, there was some other drama happening up at the main house. Belinda had put Blair's younger brother, Sean, to bed almost immediately after she tucked in Blair inside of the camper. Sean was 3 years old and he was a great sleeper. She could put him in his bed, say goodnight to him, and she wouldn't see him until the next morning. But that night, Belinda was laying in bed, and Sean multiple times would get out of his bed and come into her bedroom and say he was scared and didn't want to be in his room. Belinda would get up, she'd go back, she'd tuck him back in and say, "You got nothing to worry about, it's just a new house, you're fine, you're safe." But on the third or fourth time that this happened, because it was so out of character, she asked Sean, "What's going on? What are you so scared of?" And he says, "There's a monster in my window." Belinda assumes what he means is maybe a deer was outside or some other animal might have walked by the window, because in virtue of being a single-story house, all of the bedroom windows are at ground level. And so she goes to the window and she looks out, and it's just forest, deep, dark forest, everywhere you look. And so she's thinking, okay, maybe a deer walked by the window or a moose or something like that, and that's what he saw. And so she was able to explain to him that, it's just a new house, there's probably some deer that are coming by the window, you got nothing to worry about. And so she was able to finally calm him down and he would go to sleep. The next morning, Blair is relieved to wake up and have sunlight be coming through that little open window on the front door. She and Coco go into the main house. She sits down for breakfast with her mom and with her brother, and Belinda asks her how was camping. And Blair, who was normally a very chatty child, was very quiet about it. And her mom said, "Well, did you have a good time? Like, you gonna tell me anything about it?" And Blair just said, "I don't think I want to go camping again." And she didn't elaborate. She just didn't want to talk about it. And so Belinda didn't ask any more questions, and that was that. That day goes by without incident. And then that night, Belinda gets Sean and Blair to bed in their normal rooms. They're asleep. Belinda goes to her bed and she falls asleep. And she starts to have this very strange dream. In her dream, she wakes up and looks at the foot of her bed and she sees a boy she doesn't recognize. And he's signaling her to come with him. And so in her dream, she gets up out of her bed and she follows him out of her room and she goes out to the front yard, and it's daylight outside. And on her front yard are all these clotheslines strung all over the front yard. And there are these white sheets that are hanging from each of these clotheslines, all in different random directions. And she's trying to find this boy, and she can't find him because all the sheets keep getting in her way. She finally stops because she feels something on her toe. And she looks down, she's barefoot, and on her right big toe is a clothespin that had been pinched onto her toe. And so she reaches down and pulls it off, and that's when she wakes up. And now she's awake in real life. And so she sits up and she's kind of looking around, and she's in that immediate fog following a really vivid dream. And then she realizes that was just a dream, gets back in bed, and she goes to sleep. The next day she gets up, she gets out of her bed, and she begins pulling her blankets up to make her bed. As she's walking around the foot of the bed, she stops because she sees something on the ground. A clothespin. They don't own any clothespins. And so she's sitting there looking at it thinking, how could that have gotten there? What was that dream about? Was I awake? Was I doing something in my sleep? Was I sleepwalking? She can't make sense of it, but it totally freaked her out. That day, Belinda told her sister about this dream with the clothespin and then finding it at the foot of the bed. And her sister's like, "Look, you probably just need a break. You're alone with the kids all the time. You're isolated. Let me come over. I'll watch the kids and you can just go for a walk and do whatever. Just clear your mind." And so Belinda's sister comes over, takes the kids, and Belinda decides that what she's going to do is go explore the woods behind their house. She walks a little ways behind their property and she sees something that really stands out to her. It was a little cemetery, and it was on their property, or at least close to their property. She goes over to it and sees there are 4 small headstones. There's no writing on them, but the size of the headstone themselves, it seemed to indicate that these could have been children. And so she was very unsettled by it and decided that, you know what, I'm done with my walk and I'm just going to go back now. A couple of days later, Blair was sleeping in her room when she woke up suddenly for no apparent reason. She sat up, she kind of looked around, and she noticed that the curtains that normally would cover up her window that overlooked her bed were open. And she felt really uneasy by this, especially after that incident in the RV. She liked having those curtains closed. So she gets up to go over and shut this curtain, and she looks out the window and she sees standing in front of the tree line is a dark silhouette of a figure. It looks like a man or some person. And she freezes and she's looking at it, and she can tell that it's moving towards her. And she's looking even closer, and then she can tell it's now running at her. She shuts it, jumps into her bed, and covers herself up. As she's laying there under her covers, not knowing what to do, she hears Coco barking from her mom's room. Belinda wakes up to Coco barking and looks at what she's looking at, and it's the window. So Belinda gets up, she looks out the window, she doesn't see anything, and tells Coco to calm down. She figured, okay, maybe she saw a deer or something. And then just to be a good mom, she checks on her kids. She goes to Sean's room. Sean didn't wake up from the barking. He's asleep in his bed. But when Belinda goes into Blair's room, Blair is hiding under her covers and she's scared of something. And she asks Blair, honey, what's wrong? And Blair finally says that she saw something. She thought it was a person. She didn't know what, but it was running towards the house. And so Belinda's thinking to herself, she just saw an animal. Because that's probably what Sean saw when he thought he saw a monster outside. And I'm sure that's what Coco saw. You know, Coco's going to react to an animal. There's probably some deer that's coming right up to the window and it's scaring my kids, it's scaring my dog. And so Belinda tells Blair, you got nothing to worry about, honey. Go back to sleep. Everything's going to be fine. She calms her down. She puts her to sleep. She double checks on Sean. Sean's still sleeping. And Belinda and Coco go back into Belinda's room and they get in bed and Belinda goes back to sleep. At some point in the night, Belinda's laying with her back to the door and she feels someone tapping on the back of her head. And she's assuming at this point it's got to be Sean or even Blair who've come in there because they're scared again. And reflexively, without even opening her eyes, she says, honey, there's nothing outside. You get nothing to be scared of. Go back to sleep. There's a silence. And then she feels tapping on her head again. Now she opens her eyes and she rolls over to tell one of her two kids that everything's fine, but there's no one there. It startles her because not only is there no one there, but Coco is now on the bed growling in the direction of wherever this tapping was coming from. Immediately, Belinda flips on the light and she's looking around her room and there's nothing. Gets up and she goes into her kids' rooms. They are fast asleep. Just to be sure, she walks around the house, makes sure everything is locked. She gets back in her bed and she's sitting there with Coco and she can't help it. She's scared. Between her kids seeing stuff outside, finding that cemetery, the weird clothespin thing going on, now something feeling like it was tapping her, but no one's in the room with her. She's scared. And in fact, she would say in interviews that this was the first time that she even thought about the word haunted in relationship to what was going on at their house. The next day, Belinda just wanted to get away from the house. So she calls her mom and says, hey, can we use your car for the day to go run some errands? Her mom says, absolutely. Her mom drops the car off and Belinda...